The Stranger Who Knew Every Secret, a Hercule Poirot Mystery. Chapter 1. The Turning Tide. The causeway to Belhaven Priory was a strange and beautiful thing, a ribbon of pale stone laid bare twice a day by the retreating Atlantic and swallowed twice a day by its return. At low water it gleamed like a spine of bone connecting the Cornish mainland to the small tidal island upon which the priory stood, grey and gabled, indifferent to the centuries. At high water it vanished entirely, and whoever remained upon the island remained alone with it, cut off from telephone exchange, from doctor, from constable, from the ordinary mechanisms of the world, until the sea chose to relent. It was this peculiarity of geography that Lady Augusta Vane Tempest had always regarded as the priory's chief charm, and it was this same peculiarity that would, within the week, make of the house a sealed box containing a murderer. She did not know that yet, of course, as she stood at her bedroom window on the afternoon of the 14th of September, watching the motor cars assemble on the mainland side, waiting for the tide to drop low enough to permit crossing. She was 70 years old that week, a fact she intended to mark with a dinner of some ceremony, and she watched the gathering of her relations with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has summoned people and seen them come. "They are all here, then," she said to the woman who stood near the door with a shawl over her arm, waiting to be needed. "Edmund's motor and Cassandra's, and I believe that is Reginald Ashworth's wretched yellow thing behind them." "Yes, my lady," said Miss Florence Prentice. She was a thin, composed woman of perhaps 35, with the particular stillness of someone who has trained herself never to be noticed entering or leaving a room. She had been Augusta's companion and informal nurse for 6 years, since the old woman's heart had first begun to trouble her, and in that time she had become so thoroughly woven into the fabric of the household that the family scarcely registered her presence at all, which was, Florence had long ago decided, both the great comfort and the great loneliness of her position. "And Aldous Quill is coming up from the village this evening to go over the new arrangements for my will," Augusta continued, settling herself with some effort into the chair by the window. Her breath came short these days, a fact she despised and concealed as best she could. "There will be changes, Florence. I think it is time Edmund understood that an inheritance is not a certainty simply because one has waited for it." Florence said nothing. It was not her place to comment on the family's business, and besides, she had learned that Lady Augusta's threats regarding the will were a recurring feature of family gatherings, issued and softened in roughly equal measure, like weather. Below, on the mainland shore, the cars had begun to move at last, the tide having dropped sufficiently to expose the causeway's wet stones. Edmund Vane Tempest drove first and fastest, as was his habit, a tall, fair young man of 29, with the particular restlessness of a man who owes money he cannot pay. His cousin Cassandra followed in a smaller car, alone, her dark head bent slightly forward over the wheel in a manner that suggested she had been crying, or was trying not to. Behind her came Reginald Ashworth's yellow tourer, driven with the lazy confidence of a man who has never had to work for anything and does not expect to begin now. It was a gathering, Augusta reflected, that contained within it a great deal more tension than her birthday properly warranted. Edmund needed money and resented that he needed it. Cassandra was in love with the village doctor, Selwyn Marsh, a fact Augusta had made unmistakably clear she would not countenance, having already selected Reginald Ashworth, penniless himself, but well-connected, as the more suitable match. And Aldous Quill, who had managed the estate's accounts for 15 years, with a discretion Augusta had always admired, had lately begun to show a nervousness in her presence that she could not quite account for, though she intended, before the week was out, to ask her accountant in London to review the ledgers more closely than he had in some time. She did not mention this intention to anyone. It would prove later to be a fatal omission of a different kind than anyone might have expected. By 6 o'clock the household was assembled. Edmund sullen in the library with a whiskey he had poured himself before being offered one. Cassandra walking alone along the seawall in the lengthening light, her arms wrapped about herself against a wind that was not, in truth, especially cold. Reginald lounging in the drawing-room with the particular boredom of a man waiting to be told he is welcome, and Hobbs, the butler, moving through it all with the silent efficiency of 40 years' service, setting out the good silver for a dinner that would, in the event, never properly take place. It was Hobbs who first noticed the stranger. He came up the causeway on foot, just as the last grey light was failing, and the tide had begun, almost imperceptibly, to turn. A tall man in a worn but well-cut coat, carrying a single leather case, walking with the unhurried confidence of someone who knows precisely where he is going and is in no particular rush to arrive. Hobbs, watching from the gatehouse window, felt an obscure unease he could not have explained, the kind one feels watching a door open before anyone has knocked. The stranger reached the gate as the last violet light died over the water and looked up at Belhaven Priory with an expression Hobbs would later struggle to describe to Inspector Hardcastle. Not the polite curiosity of a tourist, nor the calculation of a tradesman, but something closer, the butler eventually decided, to the satisfaction of a man arriving somewhere he has long intended to come. "Good evening," the stranger said when Hobbs opened the door to him. "My name is Julian Ferris. I wonder if I might trouble Lady Vane Tempest for a few days' hospitality. I am conducting some research into the history of this coast, and I understand the Priory's archives are quite remarkable." It was, Hobbs reflected later, a perfectly ordinary request, made in a perfectly ordinary manner, and yet something in the stranger's pale, watchful eyes suggested to the old butler that here was a man for whom nothing was ever quite as ordinary as it appeared, a suggestion that would prove, before many more days had passed, entirely correct. Chapter 2. A Guest Uninvited. Lady Augusta Vane Tempest did not, as a rule, admit strangers to her house on the strength of a leather case and a pleasant manner. But there was something in Julian Ferris's letter of introduction, for he had sent one ahead, by the afternoon post, which had somehow escaped her notice until Hobbs produced it that evening, that gave her pause. "I believe," the letter read, in a small, precise hand, "that the Priory's records contain material of considerable interest regarding the administration of the estate during the years 1896 to 1901, and in particular regarding the unfortunate matter of Mr. Thomas Ferris, your late husband's steward. I should be most grateful for the opportunity to consult them, and I think you will find, Lady Vane Tempest, that my interest in this matter is not merely academic." She read it twice, standing in the hall in her dinner dress with the assembled family already drifting toward the drawing-room, and felt something cold settle beneath her ribs that had nothing to do with her heart's familiar irregularity. "Show him into the morning-room," she said to Hobbs, in a voice that gave away nothing. "I will see him before dinner." The interview, when it came, lasted perhaps 11 minutes, and no one but the two parties to it ever knew precisely what was said. What is known is that Lady Augusta emerged from the morning-room some shade paler than she had entered it, and that Julian Ferris emerged with the faint, contained smile of a man who has been told something he expected to hear, and that he was, by the time the dinner gong sounded, installed in the blue guest-room overlooking the sea, with full liberty to consult the Priory's archives at his leisure. An old family friend, Augusta told the assembled company, with a brittleness in her tone that Cassandra, at least, was sharp enough to notice. "A historian. He is writing something about the coast. You will all be civil to him." It was a curious dinner. Julian Ferris proved an accomplished conversationalist, drawing out each member of the family in turn with questions that seemed, on their surface, entirely innocent. Questions about the estate's history, about old family stories, about the smuggling trade that had once flourished along this stretch of coast. And yet Cassandra, watching him across the candlelight, had the persistent and uncomfortable sensation that his questions were not idle at all, that each one was a small key being tried, very gently, against a lock. "You manage the estate's finances, I understand, Mr. Quill," Ferris said at one point, turning his pale eyes upon the solicitor with an expression of mild interest. "It must be a considerable responsibility, an estate of this age. So many old accounts to reconcile. I imagine the books go back a very long way." Aldous Quill, a small, neat man, with the perpetually apologetic manner of a person who has spent his life in service to other people's money, set down his wine-glass with a hand that was not quite steady. "A very long way indeed, Mr. Ferris, though I confess the older volumes are not in my particular care. Lady Vane Tempest's late husband kept his own records, in his time." "Did he?" said Ferris, and something in the flatness of his tone made Edmund look up sharply from his plate, though he said nothing. It was Edmund, in fact, who broke the small silence that followed, with the loud, careless good humour of a man trying to dispel a mood he does not understand. "I say, Ferris, you ask a great many questions for a fellow writing a book about smugglers. One might almost think you'd come about something else entirely." Ferris turned his attention to the younger man, with the same pleasant, unhurried interest he had shown the others. "Perhaps I have, Mr. Vane Tempest. I find that history and the present are rarely so separate as people like to believe. Old debts have a way of remaining unpaid. Old wrongs have a way of waiting for their reckoning." He said it lightly, almost as a pleasantry, and the conversation moved on to other things. The weather, the tide tables, Mrs. Harcourt's recollections of a house party some 30 years before. But Cassandra noticed that her aunt's hand, resting upon the white tablecloth, had closed itself into a small, tight fist, and did not relax again for the remainder of the meal. Later that night, when the house had largely retired and only a few lamps still burned, Florence Prentice came upon Julian Ferris in the long gallery, standing before a portrait of a fair-haired man in the dress of some 40 years past, Walter Vane Tempest, Augusta's late husband, dead these many years in a boating accident off the very coast his portrait now overlooked. "You knew him?" Florence asked, surprising herself with the question. Ferris did not turn at once. When he did, his expression was unreadable in the lamplight. "I knew of him," he said. "I have spent a great deal of my life knowing of him, Miss Prentice. It is, I think, time that changed." He said nothing further, and Florence, troubled without quite knowing why, did not press him. But she found, when she returned to her own small room beside Augusta's, that sleep eluded her for a long while, and that the portrait's pale painted eyes seemed to follow her thoughts even in the dark. Chapter 3. Whispers After Dark. By the second day of his residence, Julian Ferris had contrived, with a patience that seemed almost professional, to spend a quarter of an hour or more in private conversation with nearly every member of the household, and each conversation left its subject visibly altered, quieter or paler, or sharper-tempered, according to their nature. To Edmund Vane Tempest, walking alone along the sea-wall in the grey morning, he said, "I understand you had occasion to visit your aunt's bank in Truro last month, Mr. Vane Tempest. A cheque, I believe, drawn against the estate account, bearing a signature that was not entirely your aunt's own. I wonder whether she has yet had occasion to examine it closely." Edmund's face, when he turned, had gone the colour of old ash. "I don't know what the devil you're talking about." "I think you do," said Ferris, with no particular malice, merely the flat certainty of a man stating an established fact. "I am not interested in causing you difficulty over it, Mr. Vane Tempest. I am interested in a rather older matter, but you should know that I am aware of it, and that knowledge, in my experience, has a way of becoming inconvenient at the moment one least expects." To Cassandra, walking in the rose garden with her arms still wrapped about herself, he said, "Dr. Marsh seems a most devoted correspondent, Miss Vane Tempest. I happened to see one of his letters left upon the hall table this morning, addressed in a hand I think your aunt would recognize rather better than she might like." He paused. "I have no interest in your private happiness, but I think you should know that your aunt is not the only person in this house capable of reading an envelope." Cassandra's eyes filled with sudden, furious tears. "What do you want, Mr. Ferris? What is it you actually want?" "The truth," he said, and for the first time something genuine moved behind his pale, careful face, something that might almost have been grief. "Only the truth, Miss Vane Tempest. I think, before this week is out, a great many people in this house will find that a more uncomfortable thing to give than money ever was." To Aldous Quill, cornered in the library among the estate's older ledgers, he said a great deal more, and at length, in a low voice that Hobbs, passing in the corridor with a tray, caught only fragments of, something about discrepancies, about sums that did not reconcile across 15 years of careful management, about a man's professional ruin should certain figures come to light. Quill emerged from that interview looking, Hobbs thought, like a man who has been told the date of his own execution. And to Mrs. Eleanor Harcourt, Augusta's oldest friend, taking the morning air upon the terrace, Ferris said something briefer still, but it was enough to make that composed and handsome woman of 55 set down her coffee cup with a hand that trembled, and say, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, "You cannot know that. No one living can know that." "I know a great deal, Mrs. Harcourt," Ferris replied. "I have spent 11 years learning it. You might be surprised how much a determined man can learn, given sufficient patience and sufficient grief to sustain him through it." Only Florence Prentice among the household he did not approach directly, though she noticed, with a discomfort she could not name, that his pale eyes followed her more often than seemed accountable by simple courtesy, and that on the second evening he watched her across the drawing-room with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite recognition, but some unsettling cousin of both. It was Reginald Ashworth, characteristically, who first gave voice to what the household by now privately suspected. "The man's a blackmailer," he announced over billiards that evening, to Edmund, with the careless bluntness of someone who had so far escaped Ferris's particular attentions and felt himself at liberty to be amused by other people's discomfort. "Mark my words, he's got something on half this house, and he means to have money for his silence before the week's out." "Then God help whoever pays him," Edmund said grimly, chalking his cue with unnecessary violence, "because I haven't a sou to spare, and I don't believe for one moment that he means money at all." He was, as it happened, entirely correct, though he could not have known how soon, nor how terribly, the truth of Julian Ferris's purpose would be revealed. That night, Lady Augusta Vane Tempest summoned her guest once more to the morning-room, and this second interview, like the first, was witnessed by no one. But Hobbs, passing the door at 10:30 with the last of the evening's coffee tray, heard his mistress's voice raised in a manner he had not heard in 30 years of service, not the cold authority she habitually wielded over her household, but something rawer, more frightened, more like the voice of a much younger and less certain woman. "You will not," he heard her say through the heavy oak door, "you will not do this to my family, do you understand me? Whatever you believe my husband did, whatever you believe I knew of it, it is buried with him, and it will remain buried, if I have to." The sentence did not finish, or if it did, Hobbs did not stay to hear the end of it, for it was not his place, he reminded himself sternly, to listen at doors. He continued on to the kitchen with his tray, and thought no more of it that night. It would be the last time anyone heard Julian Ferris and Lady Augusta Vane Tempest exchange a single word while he yet lived. Chapter 4. The Locked Library. The household at Belhaven Priory did not, as a rule, rise early, and it was not until past 10 o'clock the following morning that anyone thought to remark upon Julian Ferris's continued absence from the breakfast table. It was Hobbs who first attempted the library door, bearing a tray of coffee at Lady Augusta's instruction, for the old woman, having slept poorly, had nonetheless insisted that their unwelcome guest be treated with every outward courtesy until matters could be resolved more privately. The door, which Ferris had habitually locked each night when he retired to work among the estate papers, a habit the household had by now come to regard merely as an eccentricity of the scholarly temperament, would not yield to Hobbs's knock, nor to a second, louder one. It was Edmund, summoned by the butler's evident concern, who put his shoulder to the old oak panel and forced the lock, and it was Edmund, therefore, who first saw Julian Ferris slumped forward across the library's great writing desk, his face turned sideways upon a scatter of papers, his pale eyes half open and fixed upon nothing at all, his right hand still loosely curled about an empty sherry glass. For a long moment no one in the doorway spoke. Then Cassandra, who had followed close behind her cousin, made a small sound and turned away, and Hobbs, with the steadiness of long training, said quietly, "I think, Mr. Edmund, we had better not touch anything further. I will telephone for Dr. Marsh directly." The telephone, as it transpired, would not be necessary in quite the manner intended, for Dr. Selwyn Marsh, Cassandra's secret correspondent, and the only medical man within reasonable reach of the Priory, arrived within the hour by motorboat, the tide having again risen to cover the causeway, and confirmed within minutes of his examination what the household had already, with varying degrees of horror and private relief, begun to suspect. "He has been dead some hours," Marsh said, straightening from the body with a grave face. "Since the small hours of the morning, I should think, perhaps 2 or 3 o'clock. I can find no obvious wound, no sign of violence." He paused, his eyes moving briefly, almost involuntarily, toward Lady Augusta, who stood in the doorway leaning heavily upon her cane, her face the colour of old parchment. "It has very much the appearance of heart failure, Lady Vane Tempest, though I confess I am somewhat puzzled as to what should have brought it on in a man who showed every sign, until last evening, of robust health." "The shock of finding nothing he sought, perhaps," murmured Reginald Ashworth, who had drifted to the back of the small crowd with the studied carelessness of a man determined to appear unmoved by death, or the shock of finding rather more than he bargained for. No one answered him, though more than one face in the room flinched faintly at the remark. It was the locked door, more than anything, that troubled Dr. Marsh as he conducted his examination, for the key had been found upon the inside of the lock, precisely where a man working alone and undisturbed would have left it, and the single window, though unlatched, gave onto a sheer drop of some 30 feet to the rocks below, an avenue of escape no sane person would have attempted, and no evidence suggested anyone had. "A natural death, by every outward appearance," Marsh admitted, "and yet I confess I do not like it, Lady Vane Tempest. I should like, with your permission, to have the local police informed, and perhaps a more thorough examination undertaken before any conclusions are drawn." It was Hobbs who voiced what several in the room had already privately concluded. "The tide will not permit the causeway to be crossed again until past 4 o'clock this afternoon, sir. Whatever is to be done, it cannot be done before then." And so it was that Belhaven Priory found itself, for the better part of a day, sealed entirely upon itself with the body of Julian Ferris cooling in the locked library, and 7 people, Edmund, Cassandra, Reginald, Aldous Quill, Eleanor Harcourt, Florence Prentice, and Lady Augusta herself, each privately aware that the dead man had, in his brief residence among them, learned something dangerous about every one of them, and each privately wondering, with a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather, whether one among their number had decided that danger was better silenced than survived. It was into this household, sealed by tide and suspicion alike, that Inspector Hardcastle of the Truro Constabulary would presently arrive, and with him by a coincidence so improbable that even he would later remark upon it with some amusement, a small, neat, extraordinary Belgian gentleman who had, until that very morning, been engaged in nothing more demanding than the contemplation of his own retirement in a cottage some 4 miles along the coast. Chapter 5. An Inspector's Predicament. Inspector Hardcastle was a broad-weathered man of 50, much respected in Truro for his thoroughness, and much less accustomed than he would have liked to matters of unexplained death among the gentry. He arrived at Belhaven Priory at 4:30 that afternoon, the tide having at last permitted passage, accompanied by a police surgeon, a constable, and, to the considerable surprise of the assembled household, a small man of extraordinary appearance, egg-shaped of head, magnificently moustached, dressed with a fastidiousness that seemed faintly absurd against the salt-roughened stones of the Priory's entrance hall. "Forgive the intrusion, Lady Vane Tempest," Hardcastle said, removing his hat. "This is Monsieur Hercule Poirot, who is presently a guest at Trevanion, 4 miles along the coast. I understand he has had some considerable experience in matters of this kind, and as the circumstances appear, somewhat irregular, I have asked him to assist." Augusta, who received the inspector and his companion in the drawing-room with the rigid composure of a woman determined to betray nothing, inclined her head with what courtesy she could summon. "I have heard of you, Monsieur Poirot. I confess I did not expect to require your particular talents in my own house." "Few people do, madame," said Poirot, with a small bow, his dark eyes moving about the room with a swiftness that belied his otherwise leisurely manner. "And yet here I am, and here, I think, is a most interesting little problem. A gentleman dead in a locked room, on an island that the sea itself seals twice daily. It is, you will permit me to observe, a setting of considerable dramatic convenience for a murderer, should a murderer indeed be among your number. You believe it murder, then?" The question came from Reginald Ashworth, lounging near the window with an air of detached curiosity that did not, Poirot noted, quite reach his eyes. "I believe nothing yet, monsieur. I have not seen the room, nor the body, nor spoken to a single soul who knew the dead man. I believe only in the little grey cells, and in their patient employment. Inspector, I think we should begin with the library, if Lady Vane Tempest permits." The library, when Poirot entered it some minutes later, told him a great deal before a single witness had spoken. He stood for a long while in the doorway, saying nothing, his eyes moving with methodical care over the room's particulars. The position of the body, now removed but its outline still legible in the disturbance of papers upon the desk. The empty sherry glass, now bagged and labelled by the police surgeon. The decanter upon the side table, 3/4 full. The locked window with its old stiff latch. The door's lock, examined and found unforced save for Edmund's necessary violence that morning. The scattered papers themselves, many of them old and yellowed, evidently drawn from the estate's archives, several bearing the faded ink of an earlier generation's careful hand. "He was working," Poirot murmured, half to himself, lifting one of the papers with a gloved finger and studying it closely. "Working and drinking his sherry, alone, as was, I am told, his habit each evening. And somewhere in the small hours, his heart simply stopped. He set the paper down with great precision, exactly as he had found it. It is a very tidy death, Inspector. I do not, as a rule, trust death when it is tidy. Marsh says it could be natural," Hardcastle said, not without a note of hopefulness, for a natural death among the gentry was a vastly simpler matter than the alternative. The fellow's heart might simply have given out. Excitement, exertion, who's to say? "Who indeed?" said Poirot. He moved to the decanter and lifted it carefully to the light, studying the sherry's deep amber colour with the particular intensity he reserved for objects that interested him considerably more than their appearance warranted. "Inspector, I think we will have this decanter, and what remains in the dead man's glass sent to your chemist in Truro without delay, and I think, also, that we will have a very careful inventory made of every bottle of medicine in this house, beginning, I rather suspect, with whatever Lady Vane Tempest's own physician has prescribed for that heart of hers which troubles her so visibly. Hardcastle's eyebrows rose. You suspect the old lady, then? I suspect no one, mon ami, and everyone, in precisely equal measure, which is to say that I suspect the facts, and the facts have not yet finished speaking to me. Poirot turned from the decanter and surveyed the room once more, his small dark eyes coming to rest, finally, upon the portrait that hung above the library's cold hearth, the same fair-haired man whose likeness graced the long gallery, watching the scene below with the painted indifference of the dead. Who is this gentleman, Inspector? Walter Vane Tempest, Hardcastle supplied. Lady Augusta's husband. Drowned off this coast a great many years ago. Must be 35 years now, or thereabouts. Boating accident, as I recall. Before my time on the force, but my old superintendent used to speak of it. 35 years, Poirot repeated softly, his gaze still fixed upon the painted face. And our unfortunate Mr. Ferris, I am informed by Hobbs the butler, came to this house asking questions about a steward dismissed from this estate some 30 years past, a Mr. Thomas Ferris, who shares, I think you will agree, Inspector, a surname of some interest with our victim. He turned back to the room, his expression suddenly very sharp indeed beneath its habitual mildness. I think, before this day is finished, we must learn a great deal more about the year 1899, Inspector Hardcastle, than we presently know about the year of our Lord, 1934. The dead, I find, are rarely so silent as the living would prefer them to be. Chapter 6. The interviews begin. Poirot conducted his interviews in the morning room, the same chamber in which, 3 nights before, Julian Ferris had first secured Lady Augusta's reluctant hospitality, and he conducted them, as was his invariable custom, with a courtesy so complete that more than one of his subjects mistook it, fatally, for credulity. Edmund Vane Tempest came first, and came defensive, his fair head held at an angle calculated to suggest unconcern. I don't see what I can tell you, Monsieur Poirot. I scarcely knew the fellow. Met him 3 days ago, like everyone else in this house. And yet, said Poirot mildly, consulting nothing more than the small notebook he held upon his knee, I am told you visited the library rather late on the night in question, Mr. Vane Tempest. Hobbs recalls seeing you in the corridor near midnight, some considerable time after the rest of the household had retired. Edmund's jaw tightened. I couldn't sleep. I went down for a book, and found Mr. Ferris still at his work. A long pause. Yes, Edmund admitted finally, the bravado draining from his voice. Yes, all right. I saw him. We exchanged words. He'd been making insinuations about a cheque, about my aunt's accounts, things that weren't his damned business. I told him so. Plainly, I'll not deny we quarrelled. And then? And then I left him there, alive and perfectly well, drinking his sherry and smirking at me like the insufferable. Edmund stopped himself with visible effort. I went to bed, Monsieur Poirot. I did not return. Whatever happened to him after I left that room, I know nothing of it. Poirot regarded the young man for a long moment with an expression of polite, unhurried attention that somehow conveyed neither belief nor disbelief, merely the patient cataloguing of a fact among many others yet to be gathered. Merci, Mr. Vane Tempest. That will be all for the present. Cassandra Vane Tempest came next, pale and composed, and answered Poirot's questions about Selwyn Marsh and Ferris's veiled threat regarding their correspondence with a frankness that seemed, to the detective's experienced eye, entirely genuine. I was angry with him, Monsieur Poirot. I will not pretend otherwise, but I did not see him again after dinner that evening. I went directly to my room and I did not leave it. Can anyone confirm this, mademoiselle? No, Cassandra said, with a faint, unhappy smile. "I am quite alone in my unhappiness, as it happens. As, I imagine, is everyone else in this house." Aldous Quill, when his turn came, was visibly the most distressed of all the household's members, his small hands trembling faintly as he sat. And it took very little of Poirot's gentle but relentless probing to extract from him the substance of Ferris's threat. Discrepancies across 15 years of estate accounts, sums diverted in small amounts over a long period, a professional ruin that had hung over the solicitor like a blade since the moment Ferris first mentioned it. "I did not kill him, Monsieur Poirot," Quill said, his voice cracking. "I had thought, God forgive me, of very little else since he spoke to me, but I did not. I could not. Where were you, monsieur, between the hours of midnight and 3? "In my room. Alone. I did not sleep at all, if that is of any use to you. I lay awake the entire night thinking of ruin, Monsieur Poirot, and I did not leave my bed to bring it about more swiftly upon another man." Eleanor Harcourt's interview proved the most guarded of all. She answered Poirot's questions regarding the nature of Ferris's private remark to her on the terrace with a composure so absolute that Poirot found himself for the first time that day genuinely uncertain whether he faced honesty or its most accomplished imitation. "He spoke to me of old matters, Monsieur Poirot, matters that concern no one living but myself, and I do not intend to discuss them with a stranger, however distinguished his reputation. I will tell you only this. I did not kill Julian Ferris, and I had no cause to. Whatever he knew of me, he had not the slightest intention of using it for gain. He told me so himself, quite plainly." "Then what, madame, did he intend?" Mrs. Harcourt's composed face flickered, for just a moment, with something that might have been grief, or might have been fear, or might, Poirot reflected, have been some delicate admixture of both. "I think, Monsieur Poirot, that is a question you had better put to Lady Vane Tempest. I do not believe it is mine to answer." And Florence Prentice, last of all, sat very still in her chair and answered every question put to her with a careful precision that betrayed, to Poirot's attentive eye, not deception so much as old, well-practiced caution. The caution, he thought, of a woman who had spent a very long time learning to give away nothing of herself to anyone. "Mr. Ferris never approached me directly, Monsieur Poirot. He watched me, on several occasions, in a manner I found discomforting, but he said very little to me beyond the ordinary courtesies. I cannot tell you what he wanted of me, because he never told me himself. And yet I think, mademoiselle, that you have some suspicion." Florence's pale eyes met his, steady and unreadable. "I have several, Monsieur Poirot. I do not believe any of them are mine to share." Poirot closed his small notebook with great deliberation and regarded the assembled, troubled household, for by now they had all gathered, by unspoken consent, in the drawing-room, waiting upon his conclusions with the particular dread of people who suspect themselves variously guilty of something, though perhaps not the thing presently under investigation. "It is a curious thing," he said, half to himself, "that in a household of 7 persons, every single one of them appears to have possessed, before this week was out, some private reason to wish Mr. Julian Ferris silent. It is, I think, a great deal too many reasons, mesdames et messieurs. When everyone has a motive, one begins to suspect that the true motive lies somewhere a little deeper than the obvious ones presented to me, somewhere, perhaps, in that distant year of which Mr. Ferris was so very interested. 1899. Chapter 7. The year 1899. It was Lady Augusta herself, summoned at last to her own morning room for an interview she had visibly dreaded, who provided Poirot with the thread that would, in time, unravel the whole tapestry of the matter. She sat very upright in her chair, her cane resting against her knee, her face composed into the rigid dignity of a woman determined to surrender as little as possible. "I understand you wish to discuss my late husband, Monsieur Poirot." "I wish to discuss the truth, madame, whatever shape it takes. I am told that some 35 years ago, your husband's steward, a Mr. Thomas Ferris, was dismissed from this estate, and subsequently tried and convicted of theft and forgery against the estate's accounts. I am told he died in prison some years later, protesting his innocence to the last. And I am told that our unfortunate Mr. Julian Ferris was, in fact, that man's son. Augusta's hands tightened upon the head of her cane, but her voice, when it came, was steady. All of that is a matter of public record, Monsieur Poirot. I do not see what it can have to do with a death that occurred in my library 3 nights ago. I think you see a great deal more than you presently admit, madame. Poirot's tone remained gentle, but there was a precision beneath it now that had not been present in his earlier interviews. The precision of a man who has found at last the loose thread upon which the whole pattern depends. Young Mr. Ferris did not come to this house to research smugglers, madame. He came to clear his father's name. He had spent, I am informed, 11 years gathering evidence. Evidence, I rather suspect, that the theft and forgery for which Thomas Ferris was convicted were not his crimes at all, but those of another man, a man whose handwriting, perhaps, bore some resemblance to the steward's own, a man with both the access and the motive to falsify accounts that he himself controlled. The silence that followed was very long. When Augusta finally spoke, her voice had lost a great deal of its rigid composure, and something older and more frightened moved beneath it. My husband was not a careful man with money, Monsieur Poirot. He was generous, in ways the estate could not always sustain, and proud, in ways that made him incapable of admitting error. When the discrepancies in the accounts first came to light, it was simpler, far simpler to lay them at Thomas Ferris's door than to admit that Walter himself— She stopped, her composure finally breaking, just slightly, at the edges. I did not know it at first. I swear to you I did not know it. When the trial took place, I learned the truth only afterward, from Walter himself, in a moment of weakness, of confession, the year before he drowned. And by then the man was already convicted, already in prison, and Walter would not, could not, undo it without ruining us both, without ruining this family's name forever. So I said nothing. God forgive me, Monsieur Poirot, I said nothing, for 35 years, and I have lived with the weight of that silence every single day since. And when Julian Ferris arrived at your door 3 nights ago and told you he had finally assembled the proof you had spent half a lifetime hoping would never surface, what did you say to him then, madame? Augusta's eyes, when they met his, were bright with unshed tears, and something harder beneath them. Something that might, Poirot thought, have been the particular desperation of a dying woman contemplating, in her final months, the public ruin of everything she had spent a lifetime protecting. I begged him, Monsieur Poirot, I begged him to let the dead rest. I told him his father's name could not be cleared without destroying mine, and my husband's, and my family's, all of it built upon a falsehood I had not the courage to confess, even to my own conscience. I told him I would give him whatever he asked, money, an annuity, anything within my power, if only he would let it lie. And what did he say to that? He said, Augusta whispered, that he had not come for money, that he had come for the truth, and that the truth, Monsieur Poirot, would be told, whatever the cost to me or mine. He said his father had died disgraced and unmourned in a prison cell, and that he would not permit the man who had truly committed the crime to lie peacefully beneath a marble angel in the village churchyard while the world believed a lie. Her voice broke entirely now, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, her thin shoulders shaking with an effort of will that Poirot found, despite everything, almost unbearably moving to witness. I left him in the library that night, Monsieur Poirot, with nothing resolved between us, and I went to my room, and I did not sleep, and in the morning he was dead. I swear to you upon whatever remains of my honour that I do not know how or why, save that I have prayed every hour since that it was God's mercy and not some darker hand that silenced him before he could destroy us all. Poirot regarded her for a long moment in silence. his dark eyes moving over her ravaged, dignified face, with an expression that gave away nothing of his thoughts. "I think, madame," he said finally, very quietly, "that you have told me the truth of the year 1899. I do not yet think you have told me the whole truth of 3 nights past, but I think we are, at last, very close to it." Chapter 8. The Bitter Dregs. It was the report from the police chemist, arriving by motor messenger from Truro late that same afternoon, that gave Poirot the final piece of evidence his patient questioning had been circling toward all day. "Digitalis, Monsieur Poirot," Hardcastle read aloud, his broad face furrowed with the particular discomfort of a man confronting a fact more sinister than he had hoped to find. "A considerable quantity, well beyond any therapeutic dose, present in the dregs of the sherry decanter and in the remains of the glass beside the body. The chemist says a man of Ferris's evident health might have shown symptoms within the hour: irregular heartbeat, nausea, finally cardiac collapse, and that taken in sufficient quantity, dissolved in a strongly flavoured wine such as sherry, it would be quite possible for the bitterness of the drug to pass entirely unnoticed by the victim." "Just so," said Poirot, nodding slowly, as though the report confirmed rather than revealed something he had already privately concluded. "And the household inventory of medicines, Inspector, what does it show us?" Hardcastle consulted a second paper. "Lady Vane Tempest's heart medicine, digitalis drops, prescribed by her own physician, kept in a bottle in her private sitting room. The housemaid who keeps the room in order says the bottle was nearly full a week ago. It is now considerably depleted. More, the maid insists, than Lady Vane Tempest's usual dosage over that period could account for. And who, Inspector, besides Lady Vane Tempest herself, had ready access to that bottle? By the housemaid's account, Miss Prentice, who administers the dose each evening as part of her nursing duties, and Lady Vane Tempest herself, of course, who keeps the bottle in her own room and might take it up at any hour she chose." Poirot was silent for a long moment, his small dark eyes fixed upon some point beyond the window, where the afternoon light lay grey and restless upon the returning tide. "Tell me, Inspector, upon the night in question, was it Mr. Ferris's habit to take his nightcap alone, or did some member of the household customarily join him?" It was Hobbs, summoned to confirm the detail, who supplied the answer with the careful precision of a servant who has observed a household's habits for 40 years without ever once being asked to comment upon them. "Mr. Ferris took his sherry alone each night, sir, as he worked among the papers, save for the second evening of his stay, when Lady Vane Tempest herself came down to the library a little before 11, and remained with him some 20 minutes. I brought a fresh decanter at her instructions, sir, and a second glass, though I do not believe her ladyship drank from it. She does not care for sherry as a rule. Her heart will not permit her strong spirits of any kind." A small, terrible silence settled over the morning room. Hardcastle's gaze moved slowly to Poirot, who had gone very still, his fingers steepled before him in the attitude of a man assembling, piece by careful piece, a structure he has long suspected, but not yet wished to see completed. "She came to him with a fresh decanter," Poirot said softly, almost to himself, "upon the very night, I think, that she had at last understood he could not be reasoned with, could not be bought, could not be persuaded to let the dead rest in their convenient silence. She came to him, Inspector, not as a supplicant a second time, but as a hostess offering a final courtesy, a nightcap, shared in apparent reconciliation, to ease whatever bitterness lay between them. And into that decanter, before ever she descended the stairs, she had already measured a dose of her own heart medicine, sufficient to still another's heart forever." "You believe she planned it, then?" Hardcastle said grimly. "Premeditated. I believe, Inspector, that a woman who has carried a secret for 35 years, and who has watched it threaten, in the space of 3 days, to destroy everything she has spent a lifetime protecting, does not act upon sudden impulse when at last she resolves to act at all. I believe she went down to that library with her course already decided, and that the conversation Hobbs overheard the following night, the raised voice, the desperate pleading, was not, as I first supposed, evidence of her innocence, but the last performance of a woman ensuring that her household believed her resistance to Ferris persisted even after she had already, in private, resolved it by far more permanent means. He rose slowly from his chair, his small figure suddenly possessed of a gravity that seemed, for a moment, to fill the entire room. "I think, Inspector, the time has come to gather the household together, and to lay before them, at last, the whole and complete truth of what occurred in this house 3 nights ago. I do not think Lady Vane Tempest will deny it, when it is finally spoken aloud. I think, in truth, she has been waiting these 3 days for someone to say it for her." Chapter 9. Before the drawing-room fire. The household assembled that evening in the long drawing-room, as the last light failed beyond the tall windows, and the tide, once more, began its slow erasure of the causeway below. A fire had been lit against the autumn chill, and the family sat or stood about it in attitudes of careful, watchful unease. Edmund by the mantel, his earlier bravado entirely gone. Cassandra, close beside Dr. Marsh, who had been permitted, at Poirot's particular request, to remain. Reginald Ashworth withdrawn into a corner with the studied detachment of a man no longer certain his own indifference was warranted. Aldous Quill twisting his hands together in his lap, Eleanor Harcourt very pale and very still, and Florence Prentice standing slightly apart from the others, as had long been her habit, near the door. Lady Augusta sat in her customary chair by the fire, her cane across her knees, her face composed into an expression of such absolute stillness that it seemed, to more than one watcher in that room, almost more terrible than open grief would have been. "I have asked you all to gather here," Poirot began, standing before the hearth with his hands clasped behind his back, "because I believe the time has come to speak plainly of what occurred in this house 3 nights ago, and of what occurred also 35 years before that, in a courtroom in Truro, where an innocent man was convicted of a crime he did not commit." He recounted. Then, with the careful, unhurried precision that was his particular gift, the history that Lady Augusta had confessed to him that afternoon, the falsified accounts, Walter Vane Tempest's quiet crime, Thomas Ferris's wrongful conviction and lonely death in a prison cell, and the long, patient 11 years in which his son Julian had gathered, piece by piece, the proof that would finally clear his father's name. "He did not come here for money," Poirot continued, his dark eyes moving slowly about the assembled, listening faces. "He came here for justice, a justice 35 years delayed, and no less urgent to him for the delay. And in pursuing it, he learned, in the course of his research among this family's private papers, certain other secrets that each of you had hoped to keep buried quite as deeply as Thomas Ferris's innocence: a forged cheque, an embezzled account, a forbidden love, an old and painful history of one's own. He did not threaten you for gain, mesdames et messieurs. I think, in his own way, he was a man more honest than most of those he confronted, but his honesty was also, in its absolute and unyielding insistence upon the truth, a very dangerous thing to bring into a house already so carefully constructed upon the foundations of what was left unsaid." He paused, and the fire crackled in the silence, and somewhere beyond the windows the rising tide whispered against the causeway stones. Edmund Vane Tempest quarrelled with him bitterly on the night he died, and left him alive in that library, a quarrel born of guilt over a forged signature, but not, I think, a murder. Edmund's shoulders sagged faintly with something that might have been relief. Aldous Quill feared him desperately, with cause enough, but lay sleepless and alone that night, paralysed by terror rather than driven to action. Quill bowed his head, saying nothing. Mrs. Harcourt guarded an old grief that Mr. Ferris had touched upon, but had, I think, made her own private peace with him before that final night, for he had told her plainly he intended her no harm. Eleanor Harcourt's composed face flickered with something close to gratitude. "No," Poirot said, and his voice, though still gentle, had grown very grave indeed. "The hand that ended Julian Ferris's life belonged to someone with a far older, far deeper wound to protect, someone who had carried the weight of a husband's crime and a stranger's wrongful imprisonment for 35 years, in silence, and who understood, when this young man arrived at her door 3 nights ago, that her silence was at last, irrevocably, at its end. Every eye in the room turned, slowly and with a terrible inevitability, toward Lady Augusta Vane Tempest, who sat very still in her chair by the fire, her thin hands folded upon the head of her cane, and said nothing at all. Chapter 10. The Truth in the Decanter. "You will forgive me, madame," Poirot said, turning to face her directly now, "if I lay the matter before you and these others with a precision you have perhaps hoped, until this moment, to avoid. Upon the second night of Mr. Ferris's residence in this house, you descended to the library a little before 11, bearing, by your own butler's account, every outward appearance of a woman seeking reconciliation. You brought with you a fresh decanter of sherry, and a second glass for yourself, though sherry, as Hobbes will confirm, and as your own physician would no doubt corroborate, is a drink your weakened heart has long forbidden you. You did not intend to share that drink with Mr. Ferris, madame. You intended, before ever you descended those stairs, that he alone should drink from it, and that he alone should die of what it contained." The room had gone utterly silent, save for the soft collapse of an ember in the grate. "The chemist's report confirms a considerable quantity of digitalis in the decanter and in the dead man's glass. Your own medicine, madame, depleted from its bottle in a measure your housemaid herself has remarked upon as exceeding your ordinary dose. You administered it, I believe, in the course of that 20-minute visit Hobbes observed, perhaps stirred into the decanter before ever you brought it down, perhaps measured into his glass while his attention was occupied elsewhere among his papers. It matters very little now which precise method you employed. What matters, madame, is that you left that library believing the matter settled, and you returned to your own room to wait, and to perform, the following evening, for the benefit of your own household, a final scene of pleading and resistance against a man you knew, even as you staged it, to be already beyond the reach of any further persuasion." Lady Augusta's hands, folded so carefully upon her cane, had begun, very slightly, to tremble. When she spoke at last, her voice was scarcely above a whisper, and yet it carried, in the silence of that room, to every corner of it. "You cannot know," she said, "what it is to have built an entire life, a name, a family, a place in the world, upon a single buried lie, and to watch a stranger arrive at your door with the power to bring it all down in the space of an afternoon. I did not hate that young man, Monsieur Poirot. I did not even, in truth, doubt the justice of his cause. Thomas Ferris was innocent. My husband was guilty. I have known it, and grieved it in my own silent way, for 35 years." Her eyes, when they lifted at last to meet Poirot's, were bright with tears she made no attempt to hide. "But I am an old woman, and I am dying. My own heart will not see me through another winter. The doctors have told me so plainly enough. And I could not bear, in the little time remaining to me, to watch this family's name, my husband's memory, everything I have spent a lifetime protecting, be torn apart in a courtroom and a scandal sheet, for the sake of a dead man's vindication that could no longer benefit him in the slightest. I told myself it was mercy, Monsieur Poirot, that I was sparing my family a grief I alone should bear. I told myself a great many things that night as I measured out the drops. I do not think in my heart I believed a single one of them, even as I told them to myself." "And yet you did it," Poirot said quietly, with no cruelty in his tone, but no softening of the fact either. "And yet I did it," Augusta agreed, and bowed her head at last. the rigid composure of 70 years finally, entirely, broken. God forgive me, Monsieur Poirot, I did it. I killed a young man whose only crime was loving his father enough to seek the truth for him, and I have spent every hour since wondering whether I killed him to protect my family's honor or merely my own pride, dressed up in honor's borrowed clothes. I do not think, in the end, there is very much difference between the two. Chapter 11. What the Ledgers Knew. In the hush that followed Lady Augusta's confession, it was Florence Prentice, silent until now, standing apart near the door as she had stood apart, in one sense or another, through 6 long years of quiet service, who spoke at last, her voice low but steady. There is something more you should know, Monsieur Poirot, before this matter is closed, something I did not tell you this afternoon, because I did not believe it mine to share until now. Every face in the room turned toward her. Lady Augusta, still bowed in her chair, lifted her head slowly, and something in her expression, a dawning, fearful recognition, suggested she had long suspected what was about to be said. "My mother's name was Ferris," Florence said quietly. "Margaret Ferris. She was housekeeper at a small estate near Bodmin many years ago, and before that, for a brief time, in service in this very house. In the year 1898, to be precise, the year before Thomas Ferris's trial. I never knew my father, Monsieur Poirot. My mother would not speak his name not once in all the years of my childhood. She died when I was 20, and left me only a small locket and a letter I did not open for some years afterward, out of a grief I was not yet ready to examine." She paused, her composed face, for the first time in 6 years of service, entirely undefended. "The letter named my father as Walter Vane Tempest. I came to this house, Lady Vane Tempest, 6 years ago, not entirely by the accident of circumstance you have always believed it to be. I came because I wished, in some small and perhaps foolish way, to know something of the family that was in truth my own, though I never once intended to claim it, nor to trouble you with a truth I judged would bring you only pain." A sound escaped Augusta that was very nearly a sob. "You are his daughter," she whispered. "All these years beneath my own roof, and I do not believe Mr. Ferris knew this, when first he came to this house," Florence continued, her voice gaining a steadier strength now that the worst of it was spoken. "But I think, by the second night of his residence, he had begun to suspect it. I saw it in the way he watched me, Monsieur Poirot, a recognition he had not yet voiced. I think, had he lived another day, he would have come to me directly and told me what he had learned of my father's true history. And perhaps we might have found, between us, some small comfort in a shared and complicated grief. That comfort, Lady Vane Tempest, was taken from us both the night you measured those drops into his glass." She did not say it with anger, only with a deep and quiet sorrow that seemed, somehow, more devastating than fury could have been. "I do not say this to add to your judgment, Monsieur Poirot, nor to your own, Lady Vane Tempest. I say it only because I think the truth, having waited so very long already, has waited quite long enough." Augusta wept then, openly and without restraint, for the first time, Hobbes would later reflect, in the entire 30 years of his service to her, wept not merely for the act she had confessed, nor even for the dead man whose life she had ended, but for the strange and terrible symmetry of a household in which the daughter of the man wronged 35 years before had been living, all unknowing, beneath the roof of the woman who had helped conceal that wrong, and whose final act of concealment had cost that same man's son his life. "I am so very sorry," Augusta said at last, through her tears, to Florence, to the room, perhaps to the painted, indifferent face of her long-dead husband watching from above the mantel. "I am so very, very sorry. For all of it. For every year of silence, and for the night I broke it in the only way I believed remained to me." It was not, Poirot reflected, watching the scene with the particular weariness that always settled upon him at the close of such matters, an apology that could undo a single hour of what had been done. But it was, perhaps, he thought, the first wholly honest thing Lady Augusta Vane Tempest had said aloud in 35 years, and there was, even in tragedy so complete as this, some small measure of mercy and honesty arriving, however late, before the end. Chapter 12. The Reckoning. Inspector Hardcastle, who had listened to the unfolding confession with the grave discomfort of a man required to arrest a dying woman of 70 for a murder whose roots lay buried 35 years deep in another man's unpunished crime, performed his duty nonetheless with as much gentleness as the law permitted. "Lady Augusta Vane Tempest," he said quietly, when Poirot had finished speaking and the room had settled into its exhausted, grieving silence, "I must ask you to consider yourself under arrest in connection with the death of Mr. Julian Ferris. I will need to take a formal statement, and arrangements will have to be made, though I will say, given your health, that I expect the court will show what consideration it properly can." "I do not ask for consideration, Inspector," Augusta said, with the first trace of her old composure returning, though chastened now, and quieter than before. "I ask only that whatever proceedings follow be conducted swiftly, for I do not believe I have a great many months left in which to answer for what I have done, and I should like, before the end, to do what small justice remains within my power. I will instruct my solicitor," her eyes moved, briefly, to Aldous Quill, who flinched at the look but did not turn away, "to draw up papers exonerating Thomas Ferris publicly and completely, with full restitution to his memory and whatever remains of his family, and I will see that account settled before I am called to answer for my own crimes, whatever form that answering takes." She turned then to Florence Prentice, and something passed between the two women that no one else in the room could fully read. Grief, perhaps, and a strange, late-arriving recognition of kinship neither had expected to claim. "And you, Florence, I do not ask your forgiveness, for I do not believe I have earned it, nor do I believe it mine to ask. But you are my husband's daughter, and whatever provision the law allows me still to make, I will see made for you, fully and without further concealment, before I am no longer able to make it." Florence said nothing for a long moment, her composed face working through some private and complicated reckoning of her own. "I did not come to this house for inheritance, Lady Vane Tempest," she said finally. "I came only to know something of where I had come from. I think, perhaps, I have learned rather more of it than I bargained for." It was not forgiveness, precisely, that moved beneath her quiet words. But it was not, Poirot thought, watching closely, entirely its absence either. Edmund, Cassandra, Aldous Quill, Eleanor Harcourt, Reginald Ashworth, each, in turn, absorbed the evening's revelations with the particular numbness of people who have spent 3 days fearing exposure of their own small sins, only to discover that the true weight of the house's tragedy had lain all along in a far older and far graver concealment than any of theirs. Edmund's forged cheque, Quill's embezzled accounts, Cassandra's forbidden love, Eleanor Harcourt's old grief, all of it suddenly seemed, against the magnitude of what had finally been spoken aloud, smaller and more forgivable than each had believed it, in their private terror, to be. "I should like, before I am taken from this house," Augusta said, rising slowly and with visible effort from her chair, leaning heavily upon her cane, "to see my husband's portrait removed from this room and from the gallery, and consigned to whatever attic or fire seems most fitting. I have looked upon his face with false reverence for 35 years, Monsieur Poirot, and I find, tonight, that I have no further wish to do so." It was Hobbs, summoned for the purpose, who performed that small final task within the hour, lifting the portrait of Walter Vane Tempest from its place above the drawing-room hearth, with the same careful, unhurried dignity with which he had performed every other duty of his long service, and carrying it away into the gathering dark, where the painted, indifferent eyes of a guilty man would trouble no one in that house ever again. Chapter 13. a daughter's inheritance. It was some days later, Lady Augusta having been removed to Truro to await the proceedings against her, her health, as predicted, declining rapidly under the strain of confession and confinement alike, that Poirot returned once more to Belhaven Priory, at Florence Prentice's particular request, to settle a final matter that troubled her conscience. He found her in the long gallery, standing before the empty space where Walter Vane Tempest's portrait had once hung, a faint, pale rectangle upon the panelling, the only remaining trace of its 35 years' residence there. "I wish to thank you, Monsieur Poirot," she said, turning at his approach, "for finding the truth, even though it has cost this family, cost me, a great deal to hear it spoken." "The truth is rarely without cost, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, "but I think it is, in the end, less costly than the alternative, for a falsehood maintained across 35 years exacts a price quite as terrible as honesty does, only more slowly and more cruelly upon every soul obliged to carry it." He studied her for a moment with his shrewd, kind, dark eyes. "You did not kill him, mademoiselle, though I confess I held you briefly in my private suspicion, in those first uncertain hours." "I know you did," Florence said, with the ghost of a smile. "I think, in your position, I should have suspected myself as well. I had motive enough, had Mr. Ferris's investigations threatened to expose some inconvenience of my own, and a quiet, watchful manner that does not, I imagine, inspire immediate trust in a detective's eye. It is not the quiet ones I distrust, mademoiselle, but the loud ones who protest their innocence before anyone has thought to accuse them." Poirot's gaze moved, briefly, to the bare wall before them. "What will you do now, with the inheritance Lady Vane Tempest has promised you?" Florence was silent for a moment, considering. "I do not yet know, Monsieur Poirot. I think, perhaps, I shall use some part of it to see my father's, my real father's, grave properly marked at last, with his true name and what dignity the law can now restore to it. And I think perhaps the rest I shall simply use to build a small life of my own, somewhere this family's old griefs do not follow me into every room." She paused. "Dr. Marsh tells me Cassandra means to marry him after all, whatever objection might once have stood in the way of it. Lady Vane Tempest's confession has rather settled the question of who in this house has the right to object to anyone's choice of happiness." "A small mercy, perhaps, drawn from a very great tragedy," Poirot agreed. "It is often the way of these matters, mademoiselle. The truth, once finally spoken, clears a great deal of ground that falsehood had long kept choked with weeds, even as it leaves, in its wake, a grief that no amount of clearing can entirely undo." They stood together a while longer in the quiet gallery, the autumn light falling pale through the tall windows upon the empty space where a guilty man's portrait had once presided, undisturbed, over a household built upon his unconfessed sin. A household that would, Poirot reflected, begin now, slowly and imperfectly, the long work of rebuilding itself upon something more honest than the silence that had sustained it for so long. Chapter 14. The Causeway at Dusk. Poirot took his leave of Belhaven Priory, in the last grey light of that same afternoon, walking the causeway on foot, as Julian Ferris had walked it some days before, the tide once again withdrawn, to expose the pale, wet stones beneath an autumn sky, heavy with the promise of coming rain. Inspector Hardcastle accompanied him as far as the mainland shore, his broad, weathered face creased with the particular weariness of a man who has spent a career enforcing a law that does not always feel, in its application, entirely just. "A bad business, Monsieur Poirot," he said, as they walked. "A wicked old crime, buried for 35 years, finally come round to claim a young man who'd done nothing worse than love his father enough to want him remembered rightly. And now an old woman dying in a cell for it, who'll likely not live to see her own trial concluded. It is, as you say, a bad business, Inspector, and yet I think you are wrong to call it simply wicked. Lady Augusta was not, I believe, a wicked woman, in the ordinary sense of that word. She was a frightened one, who made, across 35 years, one terrible silence after another, each smaller than the last, until the accumulated weight of all those small silences finally drove her, in one desperate night, to a single great crime that none of the smaller ones had prepared her to recognize as such, until it was already, irrevocably, done. Poirot paused at the causeway's edge, looking back at the Priory's grey gables rising against the darkening sky. "It is the way of most tragedies of this kind, I find, Inspector. They do not begin with murder, they begin with a small lie, told to protect something precious, and they end, often many years later, with a much larger crime, told to protect the lie itself. The murderer, by the time she commits her crime, has very often forgotten that she was ever anything but a murderer at all, has forgotten the frightened young wife who first chose silence over scandal, all those years ago, never imagining where that single choice would, in time, inevitably lead her." "You feel sorry for her then," Hardcastle said, not without surprise. "I feel, Inspector, what I always feel at the conclusion of such matters, a deep and abiding sorrow for the waste of it. A young man dead before his work was finished. An old woman's final months spent in a cell, rather than in whatever peace her remaining time might otherwise have offered her. A family forced, at last, to confront a truth that 35 years of careful silence had only made more devastating to receive. And at the centre of it all, a steward dead in prison 30 years before any of this began, whose innocence has been restored to him only now that he is far beyond any benefit from the restoring." Poirot shook his head slowly. "It is not a triumph, Inspector, to solve such a case. It is, at best, a small mercy extended to the dead, and a larger reckoning extracted, at terrible cost, from the living. I do not believe, in such matters, there is ever very much cause for satisfaction, only the quiet, necessary work of bringing the truth, however painful, into the light where it belongs." He took his leave of the inspector then, and walked on alone toward the small cottage at Trevanion, where his own brief holiday, so unexpectedly and so thoroughly interrupted, yet awaited his return, his small figure growing smaller still against the wide grey sweep of the Cornish coast, until the gathering dusk received him entirely, and the tide, behind him, began once more its slow and patient work of sealing the causeway against the coming night. Chapter 15. Low water Lady Augusta Vane Tempest died in the early spring of the following year, before her trial could be brought to its formal conclusion, her weakened heart finally succumbing not to any further violence, but to the simple accumulated weight of 70 years and the particular griefs of her final months. She was buried, at her own express instruction, without ceremony, in a quiet corner of the village churchyard, some considerable distance from the marble angel that marked her husband's grave. A small final gesture, Florence Prentice reflected, of a woman determined that even in death she would not lie easily alongside the man whose unconfessed crime had, in the end, claimed 3 lives across 35 terrible years, his steward's sons, and at the last, in a manner of speaking, her own. Thomas Ferris's name was formally and publicly cleared that same spring, the papers Augusta had instructed before her death, duly filed and witnessed, his modest grave near Bodmin, at last marked with a stone bearing his true name and the simple, hard-won inscription, "Wrongly accused." Justly remembered, Florence saw to its placing herself, in the company of no one but the stonemason, on a grey morning, much like the one on which Julian Ferris had first walked the Belhaven causeway in search of exactly this small, posthumous justice. Belhaven Priory itself passed, in time, to Edmund. Chastened by all that had occurred, his gambling debts settled at last through an inheritance he no longer felt entirely easy in receiving, and his manner, those who knew him observed, considerably gentler for the experience than it had been before. Cassandra married Selwyn Marsh that same autumn in a small ceremony attended by what remained of the family, no longer divided by an objection that death had rendered, in the cruelest possible way, entirely moot. Aldous Quill resigned his position as the estate's solicitor. His own smaller transgressions quietly settled through private restitution rather than public exposure, a mercy he had not expected, and did not, by all accounts, ever cease to be grateful for. And Eleanor Harcourt returned, eventually, to whatever private griefs and private peace awaited her in her own corner of the world, her old secret never spoken aloud beyond that single terrible evening, and never, so far as anyone at the Priory ever learned, troubling her again. Florence Prentice did not remain at Belhaven Priory. She took the small inheritance Augusta had left her and used it, as she had told Poirot she intended, to build a quiet life of her own some distance along the coast, not so far that she could not, on certain grey afternoons, walk down to the shore and look across the water toward the Priory's familiar gables, but far enough, she found, to breathe a little more easily in rooms that were entirely, finally, her own. Hercule Poirot, for his part, returned to his interrupted holiday at Trevanion and remained there a further fortnight before the demands of London and of cases rather less melancholy than this one called him back to his ordinary occupations. He thought of Belhaven Priory often in later years, when other cases brought him, as they sometimes did, face to face with the particular tragedy of secrets kept too long and too carefully, and he found himself reflecting, on more than one such occasion, upon the strange, sad symmetry of a household in which an old woman's silence and a young man's insistence upon the truth had proved, in the end, equally capable of destruction and equally born, at their separate roots, from love. "It is the great paradox of the little grey cells, my friend," he remarked once, some years later, to a colleague who had asked him to name the case among all his long career that had moved him most profoundly. "We employ them in pursuit of the truth, believing always that truth, once found, must bring some measure of relief. And so it does in its way, but it is rarely the relief we imagine, when first we set out to find it. The truth does not undo what has been done. It does not return the dead to the living, nor restore the years a long silence has stolen from those who kept it. It does only this, mon ami, it clears the ground, at last, of falsehood, so that whatever grows there afterward might grow, at the very least, in honest soil." He paused, his dark eyes distant with the particular memory of a grey causeway and a sea that came, twice each day, to seal a house entirely upon itself. "That is not nothing, I think. It is, perhaps, in the end, very nearly everything that any of us, detective or otherwise, can reasonably hope to offer the dead, or the living left behind to grieve them." And with that, as was his custom at the close of such reflections, he said no more upon the matter, and turned his attention, with the particular contentment of a man who has done what work was given him to do, toward whatever quieter occupation the remainder of the evening might offer. The End.